Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today I want to talk to you about the most foul and depraved book ever written, The 120 Days of Sodom by the Marquis de Sade. Okay, let's start with a warning then. This is a disgusting and disturbing book. And I will talk about some things in this video which will probably be a bit troubling. So take that as a warning. You may just want to stop watching now. So this is a book I read as part of my ongoing project to read disturbing books that were recommended to me. So a while ago, as you may know, I made a video review of a book called Notice by Heather Lewis. And a number of people recommended other disturbing books in the comments for that video. And the 120 Days of Sodom and de Sade as an author, were things that came up again and again. I wouldn't go so far as to say that people recommended this book to me, but they certainly suggested it as a disturbing book to read. And it really is. What's interesting about it is that the constant kind of repetition dulls the disturbingness of it after time, and after a while it just gets a bit boring, to be honest with you. And a number of people said that to me before I read it. They said that they'd read it and they went from being disturbed to just disgusted to just bored, and that was kind of my reaction to it too. But it is an interesting book, and it's a book I never would have read if I wasn't doing this challenge. And I'm kind of glad that I have read it. I didn't always feel glad I was reading it whilst I was reading it, but on reflection, it is an interesting book. It's published now as a Penguin classic. Is it a classic work of literature? I think that's very much up for debate. But the fact that it has lasted for as long as it has, I think is some indication, not necessarily of its quality, but of the fact that there's something about it which is appallingly fascinating. So I am glad that I've read it. So, it was written in the late 1700s when de Sade was imprisoned. And he was, a character who did some pretty terrible things in his life. And that's one of the disturbing things about this book is that there are events in de Sade's past which are, where he did things very similar to some of the things that are described in this book. And that makes it extra disturbing. So he was imprisoned and he wrote this book whilst in prison. But it's worth noting as well that it is not a finished book. And in the introduction, in de Sade's introduction to it, he says as much. He says that it's not the final version of the book by any means. So it's called the 120 Days of Sodom, and the idea is that these four libertines, who are these kind of very wealthy, debauched, depraved men, have gathered together a group of different people and put them in this castle, and they will be there for 120 days, and those 120 days will be devoted to basically going through this laundry list of horrifically depraved and disgusting sexual acts. And that's basically what the book is about. But the kind of framing of it and the structure of it is, as well as this ongoing story about the passage of that 120 days, you also get certain characters who are, some of the people who've been brought into the castle, telling the stories of their background and describing their first experience of various sexual acts. And you get basically 5 of those things per day. So you get, in total, 600 appalling, disgusting sexual acts described to you. But so reflecting back on the unfinished nature of it, it's actually really only the 30 Days of Sodom, because you actually only get you only get kind of like the final version of those first 30 days. The remaining 90 days are much more kind of in note form, so it's like de Sade's notes for what he was going to write. So for each of the days and each of the 5 acts for that day, you just kind of get a couple of sentences. You don't get anywhere near the detail that you get for the first 30 days. But as you can imagine, if you are listing that many appalling sexual acts. 600. There are, every sexual act you can imagine is in here, and many that you could not imagine are in here as well. So there is, there's everything. There's sadomasochism, as you'd expect from de Sade. There is paedophilia, and that's probably the most troubling thing for modern readers, because that is heavily represented. And when de Sade talks about the various people that have been brought by these four men into the castle, a large percentage of those people are children. So you've got that. You've got bestiality. You've got necrophilia. You've got kind of elements of kind of cannibalism. Even for the most jaded of readers, I think there is stuff in here that will shock you. For example, the famous scene in American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, with the drain pipe and the rat. That is in this book, and this is what takes up the majority of those first 30 days that are detailed, in a lot of detail. You get basically people eating shit. So you get that again and again and again, to the extent that it gets, as disgusting as it is, it gets quite boring quite quickly as well. So it's a very strange book to read. And I think one of the things that's interesting about it is, and there's a fantastic introduction as well. So there's Penguin Classics edition has an excellent introduction that talks about the de Sade's life and the genesis of the book and the reputation of the book over the centuries and things like that. What's completely unclear to me, but I find really interesting, is that it's not obvious what de Sade was trying to do with this book. I still don't know, having finished it, albeit, finished it in its unfinished state, whether he was trying to make whether he was trying to make a point. So I think a lot has been made over the years about the fact that the four central characters, the four libertines, are all, wealthy men. I think one of them's a judge, one of them's a priest, and so on. And they represent, the kind of upper echelons of society. So is he making a statement about the treatment of, the populace, the common people in society by the wealthy? If he is, then he's chosen a particularly strange way to go about it, would be my view. So I don't think he is. My personal take on it is that he was just a dirty old bastard, and he is writing something for other dirty old bastards. This is a work of pornography, and some of the writing is reasonably good. It's still readable, as horrific as it is. It's still readable. However many years later we are, 230 years later. So that says something about the quality of his writing, but it's certainly not an uplifting book, or a book with a message that you take away and feel that your life has been enriched by in the way that you are supposed to with works of classic fiction. One of the other things I found interesting about it actually is that there's a lot of, and going back to this point about was he trying to make a broader point about things, there's a lot of blasphemy in this book, and there's a whole section of the kind of descriptions of the sexual acts where he is very deliberately describing things that are blasphemous. So, for example, the use of a crucifix in sexual acts, the use of the host in sexual acts, and I think back when this book was written, that content, which today seems quite tame. We've all seen The Exorcist, haven't we? It doesn't feel that shocking to us anymore. I think back then it would have been deeply shocking and offensive to people, whereas now it's... And I'm interested to know whether it would have been as shocking to people contemporary to de Sade as all the other things he writes about, which still have the power to shock us now. Or whether it would have been considered differently. Because certainly now that stuff almost seems a bit, I'm sure there are deeply religious people today who would still be hugely offended by it. but I'm sure many readers would not be offended by it in anything like the same way as they're offended by all the other horrific things that happen in the book. And it's interesting, isn't it, that whole concept of shock value. So it's fascinating to me that this is a book that is 230 years old and still has the power to shock, still has the power to offend, still feels in some ways at times like a dangerous book. And I don't want to overstate that, but there are things in here which are awful, awful things. And the fact that somebody has written a book about them in the way that this book is written, to titillate, is, still feels appalling 230 years later. So that, in itself is interesting. We think of things from the past as not having the power to shock us anymore, as being tame and, kind of dulled by time. The edge gets taken off them. But I don't think that's the case in this book. What does take the edge off things is that constant repetition that, and to the extent that at times in some of these acts he's combining so many different things, like quite deliberately combining so many different perversions, like incest and bestiality and eating shit and and blasphemy. He's combining so many things together that it just seems absolutely ludicrous. And some of his descriptions of the individuals involved as well are just so incredibly grotesque and disgusting that they almost feel like something from a Roald Dahl book. One of the characters is described as, so there's a whole thing in the book, as well as like all the shit eating, there's a whole thing in the book about people just not washing. And one of the characters in the book, he goes to great lengths to describe the cocks basically of the male characters, pretty much all the male characters. And one of the libertines is someone who never washes, to the extent that the amount of encrusted filth on his manhood adds an inch to its circumference, which is just, it's like, that's so disgusting, and it so feels like something Roald Dahl would have put in a book if he was writing his children's books for adults rather than for kids. So yeah, it's a I mean, I'm laughing, but it's a foul book. It's a foul book. And I think maybe its foulness is why it has lasted so long and why it has been continuously fascinating to people. And it was, it was banned for a long time. It was only, I think, in the 60s or 70s that you could actually go and buy a copy of it. So the fact that it is now a Penguin classic is, shows how society has changed over time. But it is still horrific. I'm not sure it's necessarily disturbing as a whole. The fact that it was written at all is disturbing. The fact of, de Sade's life and the fact that, these are things he was doing is disturbing. But as I say, just the fact that it's so long and so repetitive does just wear, just wears it down, because it does just get quite boring after a while. And it's certainly not a book. I normally read books from beginning to end without reading anything else, but this was definitely not a book I could do that with. I needed to read other things while I was reading this, because otherwise just the pure weight of all of that filth was a bit overwhelming. So it's definitely not a book I necessarily recommend people read, but it is an interesting book, and it is I don't know if it's an important book. Maybe just because of its reputation it is. Maybe that makes it important. But I think there's something interesting. I think there's something always interesting about people trying to shock. And what's interesting about it is, what is the motivation? I've talked a bit about that. And what is the impact of that shock? And often things from the past that are designed to shock, as I've said, feel almost funny after a while. And this does at times, but overall not. But if you think about, shock can be a really powerful thing and can be an important thing and can be, transgressive in a way that is useful and makes us think about our lives and our approach to things. You think about, the work of some of the surrealists and things like that in the early 20th century. I think some of their some of their work which was deliberately shocking. So things like Jean Andalou, the Louis Buñuel and Salvador Dali film. You know, it's deliberately and still to this day shocking at times. But it feels like they are trying to do something quite interesting with that and trying to make us think about things a bit. Whereas I'm not convinced de Sade is. As I say, I think this is just him being a dirty old bastard. But you also think about, you think about someone like the Sex Pistols, who were definitely shocking at the time, but now, the shock value of what they did has 100% worn off, and they feel quite tame, really. I'm not sure where this book sits in that equilibrium, if you like, that equilibrium, that range of shock. The thing, or the artist or creator that it reminded me most of, in many ways, was John Waters, the film director, and now novelist as well, whose work is, just deliberately disgusting and shocking, and he goes out of his way to be as appalling as possible. But he does it very much with his tongue in his cheek, and his films are very, very funny as a result. Whereas de Sade, when de Sade is funny in this book, he's funny unintentionally. He's funny because he's being so over the top and ridiculous. But you feel like he's actually into it. He buys into his own nonsense in a way that, whereas with John Waters is doing it because he thinks it's funny. I'm reminded as well of the Dennis Hopper character in the film Blue Velvet. So David Lynch's film Blue Velvet, where Dennis Hopper plays this character who is an appalling person, incredibly violent and destructive, but also so in the grip of his own perversions that he just completely loses control at times, to the extent that Lynch, and Dennis Hopper's performance in that film is fantastic, and it is disturbing to watch him because he's so good at what he does as a performer, but the character he plays is such a fascinating and extreme character. But David Lynch apparently found Hopper's performance hilarious. He found it really funny and would like be, doubled over with laughter during the filming of it, because of the fact that Frank Booth, the character, who is this horrific, violent, powerful man, is so consumed by his own perversions that he becomes ridiculous. And I kind of feel the same way about de Sade. He was clearly an appalling human being. He was cruel, he was destructive, but he's so, to have written a book as long as this, that goes into that as much detail as this does, about such appalling things, to have spent so much of your time doing that, is almost comical, because it just makes him seem ridiculous as a person, as appalling as he was. And it's an interesting book, but I'll leave it up to you whether you read it or not. Okay, time for a random book from the shelves. This is another one of those disturbing books, but one that I think people consider to be, artistically at least, a more successful one. Story of the Eye by Georges Bataille, which is a kind of pornographic work of surrealism, is what I believe it to be, and one I will be reading soon. So I hope you found that interesting. If you've read The 120 Days of Sodom, please let me know in the comments your take on it. I still don't really know what I made of it. And that's probably apparent from my rambling in this video. But it is, as I say, it is an interesting book. But anyway, as always, thank you very much for watching. I hope you're safe and well out there. I hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.